the spirit of charity and justice, that we may in all things walk before you with steadfast purpose and a single heart, and faithfully serve our offices through Jesus Christ our Lord. Most gracious God, author of all good things, we humbly pray for the Parliament of Barbados, especially for the Senate at this time assembled, that you would be pleased to direct and prosper all our counsels to the advancement of your glory, for the nourishment of faith, and the safety, honor, and welfare of your people. All this we ask in the name of Jesus, Christ our Lord. Amen. And may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all, now and forevermore. Amen.
Senate is now in session.
You can use
The messages from Her Excellency the Governor General. Announcements by Your Honor the President.
I'm to advise that I've heard from Senators Grant and Moore that they will be late. Senator Franklin has advised that he is not well. We wish him a speedy recovery.
Senator Moore as well. Senator Moore as well.
Senator Moore has advised that she is hoping to join us later. Yes, I think that covers the extent of the communications we've had from the senators.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
Mr. President, I'm commanded to lay the following documents. Audited financial statements of the Barbados Water Authority for the years ended March the 31st, 2015 to March the 31st, 2017. Report of the Judicial Appointments Committee, April 2019 to January 2020. Annual reports and audited financial statements of the Grantley Adams International Airport, Inc. for the years ended March the 31st, 2017 to March the 31st, 2018. Audited financial statements of the Caves of Barbados Limited for the financial years ended March the 31st, 2017, March the 31st, 2018, and March the 31st, 2019. And the annual report and audited financial statements of the Fair Trading Commission for the period April the 1st, 2018 to March the 31st, 2019.
Reports from select committees, questions to ministers, requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate, moved by minister.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the standing order 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting to allow us to complete a number of bills in all of their stages.
The question is that standing order 45-2 be suspended for the balance of the day's sitting. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it, and the standing order is there suspended.
Introduction of bills.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice of the following: a resolution to approve under Section 3 of the Special Loans Act, Cap 105, the borrowing by the government of the sum of Barbados $2,493,271 from Scotiabank Barbados Limited to repay an existing overdraft facility held by the Caribbean Broadcasting Corporation. I also give notice of the Income Tax Amendment Number 2 Bill 2020, the Public Transport Miscellaneous Provisions Bill 2020, and the Transport Authority Validation Bill 2020. I beg to move that those three bills be now read a first time. In addition, I also beg to move that the following bills be also read a first time: the Stamp Duty Amendment Bill, Amendment Bill 2020, the Registration of Judgments Amendment Bill 2020, the Catastrophe Fund Bill 2020, and the Planning and Development Amendment Bill 2020.
Seven bills. The question is that the 7 bills indicated by the Honourable Leader of the House be now read the first time. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it, and the bills indicated have now been read the first time. Some plain paper here. I thought he had some plain paper.
Public businesses.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 5, in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Catastrophe Fund Bill 2020.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, this bill, if passed in this honourable chamber today, will mean that the Catastrophe Fund Act, Cap 39D, will be repealed. And that was passed in 2007, at a time when the government of the day conceptualized and created what was the Catastrophe Fund. In fact, the act came after and gave birth, as it would, to the Catastrophe Fund, or indeed covered the Catastrophe Fund. And this was felt needed and necessary at that time because there were a number of house fires which were occurring. And I remember I was part of the cabinet at that time, and there was concern that in a number of these cases, there were a number of persons of low-income families, oftentimes, indeed most times, without insurance to cover their properties, and that there was a lot of suffering and the whole issue of politicians and ministers doing fundraising and trying to help people in terms of restoring some respectability to their lives in terms of donations and housing. And they thought that it was really absolutely necessary that a fund should be established to provide for situations like this, added to the fact that we'd had a lot of clear misses from tropical storms. I don't remember the names of some of them, but I do remember that in terms of during that period, we had about 2 or 3 in which roofs were removed and people had difficulty. The UDC and the RDC was trying, but certainly we felt that it was absolutely necessary that provision should be made for these situations. And sure, the Catastrophe Act was brought into fruition, and the fund allowed and spoke specifically to help those persons, low-income earners, earning less than $25,000 per annum, and certainly in terms of houses, and like if I can quote it, said, and occupied chattel houses where a wood or concrete block unit does not exceed $150,000. The fund was initially financed, and this was agreed that the government of Barbados would provide $2.5 million annually towards this fund, and that in addition, contributions to the fund would be paid by every employer. I believe all honourable members of this chamber know that 0.1% of the earnings, both for those employed and self-employed, are collected monthly towards this fund. I'm informed that in March this year, March the 31st, the fund had about $51.4 million in the portfolio balance was $51.4 million. And so this fund has been there in place since 2008. I think it came into force April the 1st, 2008, until now. In April, the Honourable Prime Minister, while she was speaking in terms of measures to deal with COVID, mentioned among us a number of things, that there would be, I believe it was VAT fund, I'm trying to find the name of it again, losing old age is something else. A VAT loan fund. A VAT loan fund.
You haven't left me to say anything, sir.
Sir? I said old age, I'm claiming it. A VAT loan fund. But Catastrophe. And this has generated, since she's made this announcement, to $40 million, which would go to certain business persons who paid, registered, they've been paying their VAT, their turnover roughly over $200,000 a year, and they show how they have been drastically affected financially in their business because of COVID. And this has generated a lot of discussion, and naturally so. Persons are wondering why would a catastrophe fund would be used for this. First of all, my understanding of a catastrophe, sir, it is an event of grave and great and something sudden. Okay. Severe damage and suddenly it occurs. And it can cause damage and or suffering. And I'm saying that the present COVID pandemic is almost, to borrow a phrase from the younger generation, almost like a double whammy. You have a pandemic, a health crisis, a global public health crisis. In addition, you have it resulting in a almost total shutdown globally in terms of countries, in terms of their economies. So you're having now an economic catastrophe on top of this global health crisis. So to all intents and purposes, the use of the catastrophe fund in a situation like this is not far-fetched, as some would have us believe. I think all of us, and we've spoken about this in this chamber before, I believe we've spoken on 2 or 3 occasions, in terms of the effects, the deleterious effects, and it has had on Barbados, in terms of our tourism, in terms of our economy. I think we might differ in approach or use of language, but I believe that all members in this honourable chamber, on both sides, in spite of whatever political persuasion they might have or might not have, would agree that Barbados was doing fairly well, certainly in terms of the macroeconomic situation in the last 2 years. And we were feeling sort of relieved early this year. And then comes COVID-19, comes to us like a shock and suddenly and devastatingly. And the government has been trying its best to deal in this situation. In terms of the health reaction, I know that members on the other side thought that the shutdown came too late, but it came, and the shutdown has resulted in tremendous losses in terms of jobs. People have been laid off. The hotels have been practically closed, I believe, apart from the few that are offering their services now as quarantine facilities for those who want to pay to have quarantine in a private facility. In terms of the retail shops, every aspect of life in Barbados has been affected, and drastically so, by this COVID pandemic. And the government, a government that has been accused in this very chamber by members on the other side of not caring, has endeavored to assist in all sectors. All sectors. We've started in terms of those persons, in terms of the household survival program, recognizing the need to ensure that persons don't fall through the economic cracks in terms of poverty, and recognizing that in terms of welfare support, that there was a need to increase it and to add an additional 10 million so that the welfare grants could be increased by 40%. Has provided in terms of the household mitigation for those persons who are described as vulnerable, can at least have access to about $600 per month. The unemployment benefit, no doubt, fund has been under tremendous strain. The last time I heard, there were over 40,000 claims for unemployment with the NIS. And obviously that will put the unemployment benefit fund on the strain. We recognize that the self-employed persons were complaining that they were registered, they pay NIS, business is down, and there is no recourse. And they provided a business cessation benefit of $20 million, allowing them to be paid monthly $1,500, and this is for April and May. Went further and recognizing also that you have the small businesses, and indeed my colleague senator will be very pleased with this, even looking out for the small businesses, again recognizing in the face of those who might claim falsely, of course, that the government is only interested in the big business, that recognize the importance of the small businesses and that they were drastically affected, and so provided a fund whereby they could get at least $500 per month per employee, up to 5 employees. They've also created a small hotel investment fund, recognizing how hard the hotels would have been struck by the repercussions of COVID-19. And then we come to what we're discussing today, in fact, the VAT loan fund of $40 million. Recognizing that businesses are going through a terrible state at this point in time, recognizing that they need to assist them, because we well recognize that the economy has been practically in April and May ground to a halt. Revenue has been embarrassing in terms of government's revenue, yet we are expected to maintain all the services, and we have been maintaining the services. And I believe that the government should be commended for the job it has done thus far in these trying circumstances, be it in terms of health care, be it in terms of maintaining the social services, be it in terms of a social safety net for those vulnerable households, and also in terms of trying to encourage and maintain businesses so that they can continue to generate revenue and indeed to keep people at work. And hence, they thought it would be useful having these funds. It is a catastrophe, and to provide some breathing space for these businesses. As I said earlier, there are certain criteria in terms of them being registered and paying VAT, and in terms of them being to apply to this fund for 12 months, interest-free, and I think they're entitled to 50% of what they would have filed previously in terms of VAT. And we've heard it said that why the catastrophe fund? But we've not been told what were the solutions. I believe I heard the Honourable Leader of the Opposition in the other chamber making some reference to the fact, and I'm sorry that he didn't speak to perhaps his colleague senator in this place, in terms of why wasn't government then using the VAT funds rather than taking this from the catastrophe fund? Why couldn't government allow those people to owe VAT and start give them a loan? At a time when I said that revenue has almost dwindled to zero. So you're saying that we've drastically reduced VAT income coming in, VAT revenue, that you should even make it worse by using this to stimulate the business sector. And that's why I was wondering that perhaps he would not have discussed that with the very eloquent and enlightened senator on the honourable side within this chamber, who happens to share the same political affiliation as he does. Oh, so I believe. So in effect, Mr. President, it is, to all intents, fairly straightforward. And as a result of the decision, certain amendments were necessary to the original legislation. As a result, Section 2 had to be expanded in terms of the definition of a catastrophe to include the term global pandemic and non-natural disasters, and they have gone further to include acts of terrorism and breaches of cybersecurity, recognizing the state of the world in these days. I believe Section 4 has been also amended in terms of not only eligible persons, but speaking in terms of qualifying businesses in need of aid. Section 5 has simply been amended in terms of the categories again, it speaks to that. And of course, there was the issue of the committees. Initially, there was one committee which dealt with, and this will be covered under the schedules, that you have an economic catastrophe committee and a physical committee. Initially, there was one that in terms of assessing the needs of those persons in terms of the houses and the physical structures. Now we're looking in terms of the economic catastrophes, as I spoke to earlier. Of course, the Board of the National Insurance will continue to have oversight over the fund, and essentially, those are essentially, in a nutshell, the main amendments in terms of the original act. Mr. President, as I said earlier, and when I started, to my mind, it was a fairly straightforward and sensible and rational decision, recognizing the need to support the businesses at this point in time, giving them some breathing space in terms of VAT, using the catastrophe fund to provide the loan for them over 12 months, and allowing them, in effect, giving us in terms of being able to collect revenue and continue the revenue stream. So I think it is a very important amendment in terms of changes in terms of the catastrophe bill, and recognizing, though it is some 13 years later, in terms of the need to refine the definition of a catastrophe. Mr. President, with these two words, I beg to move that this bill be now read a second time.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hayes, are you ready? Senator Drake.
Thank you, Mr. President. I raised this morning to make a brief contribution towards the catastrophe fund bill that is before us. and I think the leader of government business did a reasonable job in giving us an overview of why the old act is being repealed and this new act is being brought into fruition, I should say. But sir, I want to just quickly highlight some of the major changes that I see within the new bill. The first clause, sir, that speaks to committees, as was rightly noted, speaks to now 2 committees that would oversee how claims,
Yes,
I hope this is better,
yes, very much better, thanks.
how claims are now processed with a physical catastrophe committee and an economic catastrophe committee. And sir, I commend the government for including those 2 committees and outlining them explicitly within the legislation, because I think what COVID has shown us is that we need to be a bit more comprehensive in how we treat to disasters and what are the direct and indirect effects from disasters, because although we're dealing with a health crisis, this is very much an economic crisis, and some have also called it an economic catastrophe. So I believe that measure, as it relates to the introduction of those 2 committees in clause 6, if I said 2, just my apologies, but clause 6 to the bill is to be commended. Sir, what I'd also want to highlight is in clause 8 of the bill. It states that the Director of National Insurance shall A, keep proper accounts of the fund and proper records in relation thereto, B, prepare a monthly statement of the accounts of the fund, and C, no later than 2 weeks after the end of the month, submit the statements to the Chairman of the National Insurance Board and the Director of Finance and Economic Affairs. And that clause goes even further, and it states in subsection 2, the accounts of the fund shall be audited at least every financial year by the Auditor General. Sir, and this is where I'd like to start to make the intervention regarding how we manage the National Insurance Fund in its totality. Sir, with no actuarial review since 2016, it could be said that we're almost operating somewhat blindly. Operating somewhat blindly as it relates to the actual value of the financial position of the national insurance. And know that we have the significant impact of over 40,000 claims being processed through the NIS and placing more pressure on the fund. I think, sir, it may be time that we put that the actuarial review is actually legislated. And that, I think, would have been a good addition to this bill this morning. What we do know, as it relates to the claims, as it relates to unemployment claims, is that the last figure I've heard in the public domain, I don't know if that figure has been updated. I stand corrected if there's a new figure to date. When we were at 23,000 claims, just about, it was about $26.4 million. And I don't know what the over 40,000 claims being now processed, what number are we at now as it relates to the total amount? What is the value of those claims to date? But sir, that is all on the backdrop. As I said, we have not had an actuarial review since 2016, and we've also experienced, or the NIS rather, has also experienced a hit due to the debt restructuring that we've just recently wrapped up as well. That loss, Mr. President, I believe, over the course of the debt restructuring, was amounted to $1 billion. I'm not sure I stand corrected as well on that figure. So those are some areas which, for me, I think, and the rest of Barbados would prompt us to include in legislation that it be mandatory that we have actuarial reviews of the NIS. I am not sure if that is outlined in the NIS Act itself, but surely it is not outlined here under the Catastrophe Fund bill that is before me. Sir, another factor that is also going to play heavily on the NIS is that of the recent pronouncement by the Prime Minister as it relates to our population. We have an issue where we are, in another 15 years, I believe she said, we'll see a declining population. And that also will have a significant impact on the NIS and how it's able to meet its obligations. Sir, if we're also saying that we have no actuarial review since 2016, we now have an economic catastrophe on our hands that millions of dollars are being paid out on the backdrop of less benefits coming in because of the lower employment levels, then, as I stated, I think that it is time that maybe possibly we legislate actuarial reviews for the fund. And if it is already legislated, then why hasn't the right action been taken to address this immediately, and those who are responsible for the fund being held accountable? So, sir, looking at the bill and noting its original intent, and I know a lot of people would associate the catastrophe fund with the hurricane season and any claims that would be paid out in the hurricane season. I also have not heard as well what is the state of the catastrophe fund, what is the value of the amount in the catastrophe fund. And I say that not necessarily being facetious, but given the fact that the hurricane season that we're in now has been classified as going to be well above average. And we know that Barbados is, I don't want to use the words that we're due for a major hurricane. And are we in a financial position to accommodate that type of event, given that we're now using the catastrophe fund to compensate those as it relates to the businesses who have filed that in an orderly fashion, I would assume, and they can now seek relief through, I'm hearing aside, sir, how they can seek relief through the catastrophe fund. So, sir, those are just my interventions and just looking at the bill in what the government is trying to do and bringing up those impacts that, for me, I'm still a little unsure of how financially viable the fund is. And those three things, as I mentioned, sir, are what are the impacts or the forecasted impacts on the fund as it relates to the COVID claims and the unemployment claims in that manner, because we have less contributions coming in, and we also have an exponential increase in claims, the debt restructuring and the impact that has had on the fund, and then, as I said, that medium to long-term issue of population and how are we going to address that in the future, given that we are in a place where we have to look at how do we populate Barbados in a way that we still have our systems functioning in a way that finances the older generation or the more mature generation going forward. So, sir, those are just my few interventions, and I hope that some of the questions I would have posed, there are some answers. But one of the things I really want to hit home is the legislating of an actuarial review of the NIS. And with that intervention and contribution, Mr. President, I thank you and I'm obliged to you.
I recognize Senator Dr. Haynes. Sorry. Senator Holder.
Thank you, Mr. President. There's several doctors, I understand, in the chamber now. It's sometimes a bit challenging to keep up. I suspect that very shortly we'll be also congratulating Reverend Rogers on his doctorate as well. I rise this morning, Mr. President, to make a very short contribution to this debate. The focus before us is the amendment to the Catastrophe Bill, and to repurpose this fund, if you will, I like to couch it within the context of being relevant for the issues at hand. We heard, Mr. President, in the contribution by the Leader of Government Business, and just to reiterate for my colleague on the other side, that as at March 2020, there was some $51.4 million in this fund. So at the end of the last fiscal year, we are told that the fund was capitalized to the amount of $51.4 million. Why are we here then this morning? The reality is, Mr. President, that COVID-19 can be considered and classified by all the definitions that we would see in our dictionaries as a catastrophe. The most common definition that we refer to is a sudden and widespread disaster, and that is a catastrophe. I don't think that there's anyone in the chamber that will disagree that that is, in essence, the reality of COVID-19. It is sudden. There not many persons, if any at all, that would admit to being able to predict it. I know that there's some who refer to the work of Nostradamus of old, but I don't think that there's anyone that would readily admit to being able to predict COVID-19. So it is sudden. It is a sudden issue. It's a sudden crisis. And it is widespread. It's a widespread disaster. It has left a deleterious impact on not only our economy, but also our community. So we know that it qualifies as a catastrophe. Now, why am I emphasizing this the beginning of this intervention, this short intervention? Is because, Mr. President, I've heard in the other place, and might I add, in the public domain, queries and questions around why would we wish to touch these funds at this time, that COVID really do not, justify these funds being used. And Mr. President, I would hasten to disagree, because this is, in essence, a disaster that has struck this nation. And, government is about governing, and government is about making decisions in the best of times and making decisions in the worst of times. And the fact is, we have a situation before us that warrants the kind of leadership and the kind of decision making at this juncture to address the crises that are before us. And so, the use of this fund, the repurposing, if you will, of this fund to treat to issues that, yes, are catastrophic, but of an economical nature, I think, Mr. President, is worthy of note, worthy of commendation. So I wish to support what we're doing here this morning. And to put it into context even further, The repurposing of this fund, Mr. President, is to assist with a critical sector of our economy, a critical sector of what we know as life here in Barbados, and that is our business community. I don't think that there are many who really have an appreciation for what COVID-19 has done to the business sector. You look across the pages of the daily papers and you see the comments, you hear the cries. Where I sit, Mr. President, I have to deal with this on a daily and a weekly basis. I'm saying to this chamber that businesses out there are suffering as a result of this catastrophe, as a result of this disaster. No fault of their own, Mr. President. No fault of their own. Because COVID-19 came upon us, as I said before, suddenly. At the end of the last fiscal year, all of the data would have suggested to us that Barbados was on the right track relative to its fiscal position. Government would have spent the last 18 or so years, as we know, in this program, seeking to what I would describe as steady the ship of state, to make sure that our economy did not fall off the cliff, as it were. We know that there was a target of a 6% surplus that was met. We got the glowing reports from the IMF. I know a lot of people don't like to hear of that organization, but hello, this is a creature that we have to work with globally. But we got glowing reports. And so we were on track, Mr. President, to put our economy on a growth path. Here comes this catastrophe. Now, what is the role of government in these circumstances? Some time ago, I spoke to this reality that government, yes, has to be able to rise to the occasion and defend and protect the vulnerable. I hold to that view strongly. And as I said, government is about governing. And so when we have crises, when we have these kinds of situations, government is, Mr. President, the one key player maybe in the overall society that has to do more to protect, that has to do more to preserve, that has to do more to steady this ship. And I'm satisfied that that is what we are seeing in the repurposing of this fund. That government understands that it has to make sure that the business sector does not fall through the cracks and therefore provide these funds to help support those that would need them at this point in time. No, Mr. President, that, in my view, is worthy of commendation. I know that there are those who would oppose for the sake of opposing. This seemed to be the reality of politics, maybe. The reality of some who, I don't know, maybe can blame it on COVID. They're at home and maybe a little more time on their hands, and they are opposing for the sake of opposing. I could not fathom why persons would object to repurposing this fund. I couldn't fathom. I mean, I listened to the debate in the other place, couldn't understand why you would have a challenge with being able to establish at this time a buffer for the business community. And you're doing so against a backdrop of in excess of $1.7 billion in foreign reserves. Mr. President, this is not the early 1990s when we had that catastrophe, yes, when we had that crisis, and we were not able to rise to the occasion primarily because we did not have the reserves. We didn't have the buffer, but having now in excess of $1.7 billion in foreign reserves, we have the import cover. We're also aware of the fact that the BERT program funded by the IMF is supported by a number of contractual conditionalities, if you will, that I'm told include the various disaster clauses that should a disaster strike, God forbid, that we're able immediately to trigger those clauses and therefore be able to access the resources that are needed in the millions of dollars, might I add, to help recover during such a disaster. So when you look at the context, Mr. President, we have been able to put in place the safeguards in the event of a disaster. And so my first thought is, why? Why would persons oppose, object? Why? Mr. President, I don't understand it. Is a business sector that at this time needs the capitalization for the operational support, to be able to invest in equipment and so on, to be able to migrate to the technologies for this digital environment, why would they object? But, Mr. President, I've concluded that we live in a time, unfortunately, so when people will object sometimes just for the sake of doing so. But I am satisfied. I am satisfied that repurposing this fund is a step in the right direction, because we are treating not only to the environmental disasters, if you will, if you can call them that, but we are treating to the economic disasters that can affect our economy, and in this situation here with COVID is affecting our economy. So I'm satisfied with that. My second thought then, Mr. President, is the business community that will be able to benefit now from this VAT fund. Those that earn in excess of $200,000 per year. Those, Mr. President, that contribute significantly to employment, they contribute significantly to economic activity, that they now are able to access funds to stay afloat during this time. Now, why is this critical? Those of us who understand how the economy works, how the economy functions, would have an appreciation for the fact that the three key players within the economy, the government, the businesses, and households, rely largely, and maybe I have a bias here, on the business community, because it's really businesses that trade. Yes? Governments don't trade, and households don't trade. So businesses trade. And therefore the economic activity that we expect within an economy comes from businesses. And any government that understands this, any wise government, any prudent government, will seek to do what it can, within reason, yes, within the law, morally and all that, to facilitate business, to encourage business, to support business, because we understand that this is what fuels economic activity within the country. Our data, and I've referred to this before, and permit me, Mr. President, give me a little leverage if I refer to it again. Our data suggests that in Barbados, we have, and with some attrition, I believe, I'll round it off maybe at this point to a little over 8,500 formal enterprises operate in this country. At the time of the survey, it was a little over 9,000, and I know that there have been some closures, Mr. President, so I'm going to suggest about 8,500. And that is formal businesses. Equally, the data suggests there's a similar amount in the informal economy, contributing significantly to economic activity on a monthly basis, or a daily basis. And these firms, Mr. President, with the exception of government, the non-government employees, are responsible for contribute significantly to employment. Significantly to employment generation. These are the ones that are therefore supporting, if you will, households. The second player within the economy. These are the ones that are supporting those vulnerable groups across our communities, across our villages, our districts, and so on. These are the ones that are hiring people. These are the ones, Mr. President, that are contributing to the third player, the government, by way of taxes, by way of duties and the like. This is how government is earning revenue to provide the social services for the country. So we need businesses. I'm making a case, therefore, today that we have to support the business sector. And so those that earn in excess of $200,000, they now are able to approach the Barbados Revenue Authority and apply for this VAT fund. And it is an interest-free fund for 12 months or thereabout. Interest-free. So there's no interest being charged on this loan. And provided that you've been able to pay your VAT during the prior periods, the records are there to support this, you're able to access this fund. And this fund will help to maintain your employment. This fund will help to cover your operating costs. This fund clearly will help to reinvest in your business processes and your business model to be able to improve your business model for the digital environment that we're in. And so as a result of supporting, Mr. President, those businesses and that section of our economy, we're able, by extension, to help the other two players that prop up the economy, households and government. Now, I'm satisfied, Mr. President, that this government has responded to the business community. I am satisfied of that. Because as COVID struck, I am aware from the myriad of hats, Mr. President, that there have been meetings with the private sector association, there have been meetings across various interest groups, and at all occasions bar none, our Prime Minister, Mr. President, and her team has engaged in a number of consultative processes, the private sector, ensuring that they listen to the needs, they listen to the concerns of the private sector, that they're deliberating, if you will, on solutions to assist this sector at this time. I am satisfied that has been the reality of this government in the last few weeks. Now, I have been a part of other crises in this country. I have been a part, Mr. President, of an organization I lead when we had other catastrophes, if you will, other disasters that struck. And I can say to you without fear of contradiction that that was not the case with prior administrations. I can say to you that we've had in this country to face other crises, and the last administration in particular did not hold the kind of consultations and the level of dialogue that we are seeing today with this administration. I can tell you that, Mr. President, without fear of contradiction. So what we are seeing, therefore, is an effort on the part of government to listen to the concerns of the private sector, to engage in finding solutions, to engage in identifying what are the answers to the problems, to the questions that confront us. Engage, Mr. President, in coming up with the kind of responses that will help us at this time to go through this crisis. I am satisfied that we have been seeing that. And so the call for financial support the call for a fund that can help businesses to capitalize their operations at this time, that call came out of these consultations. And so to be able to find the resources, I think Mr. President would have engaged the administration, and clearly recognizing that, as I said before, this particular disaster can justifiably be considered a catastrophe. This fund was identified to support those businesses. And my third, maybe and final thought, I decided it wasn't going to be long. Yeah, only one more point, Mr. President. The administration of it now is the area of concern. You know, they often say, and I don't particularly like the concept, but I'll use it. I think it's relevant in this case, that the devil is in the details. The devil is in the details. The devil is in more things than details, but the devil is in the details. So the administration now of it will be my concern. I know that the bill referred to 2 committees. Yes, that look at the physical situation and the economic one. I'm aware that it was announced earlier that the Barbados Revenue Authority would have some part to play in the administration of the fund. And so I would wish to use this opportunity to call for the kind of processes and the kind of systems that are responsive to the needs, the anticipated needs of the business community. As we know, businesses do not operate in layers of bureaucracy. That is a reality. That's not the reality of business. Businesses understand very, very clearly, Mr. President, that time is money. We live in that kind of fast-paced environment. I'm not saying that the private sector is holier than thou and has it all, all together and that there are no faults. But I'm simply saying that there's a different culture, if you will, within the business sector, the business community, and sometimes the government service. There's a different culture. And all I am calling for is that we put the systems in place that would allow for that kind of rapid response, that would allow for a level of nimbleness in the application processes and so on, that our firms can now access these funds. Because what we do not want, Mr. President, is for our administration, yes, to respond quickly to the needs of key constituents, put the funds in this case in place or other programs in place, and then the intended beneficiary cannot access. The intended beneficiary then is deterred from accessing because of the process involved. We don't want that. So we want to make sure that all persons appreciate that we are in this, yes, together, and therefore the government service, the government departments that will be responsible for administering this need to appreciate that time is money. Need to have a greater understanding that firms cannot wait inordinately long periods of time to be able to access financing in this particular environment. This, Mr. President, is something I would wish to echo, because we know, we've seen it time and time again. We've seen it in the past, where we put these mechanisms in place. We respond, yes, to the needs of our constituents, the needs of our sectors that we're here to serve. And then we have a myriad of bureaucratic processes in place that prevent those that we are targeting from getting the support and getting the assistance that we intend on. So I would wish to signal to all concerned that it is equally important now that we have repurposed this fund to make sure that those who earn above the 200,000 VAT threshold, that they can access an interest-free loan, that we now make sure that the systems are in place to have that rapid response, that the underwriting processes are there to be able to treat to those who will come to apply for this loan, that they can access the funding in a quick manner, in an easy manner, and not be deterred from this process. So, Mr. President, with those words, I support the repurposing of this. I support the amendments to the bill. I think that this makes good sense at this point in time. This is good governance, being able not to touch, you're not touching the other revenue streams that you have. They're just saying that particularly in crises, you don't go and stop and hinder the ability to collect taxes in other areas. If something is already working, you don't touch it. So I support taking this that has been there, Mr. President, and repurposing it now for another form of catastrophe. I believe this is good governance. And with those words, Mr. President, I'm obliged.
Thank you, Dr. Holder. I now recognize Senator Dr. Haynes.
Good afternoon, Mr. President and colleagues. I just want to make a brief contribution on this bill. So globally, we all know that COVID has caused around 7 million infections and over 400,000 deaths. But even so, the UNDP has said that COVID-19 is much more than a health crisis. There's been a lot of talk in public spaces about what is a catastrophe, why are we raiding the catastrophe fund? But if ever there was a catastrophe, no one can argue that COVID-19 is not the mother of catastrophes. The fund was originally created in 2007, and it had a very, very narrow focus. Literally, it was created to allow for home repairs on chattel houses that were damaged in the case of, based on the definitions outlined in the act that we're now trying to repeal, a very narrow range of environmental disasters, including storms, floods, storm surges, those kinds of things. But 23 years later, there's a necessity to adapt that legislation to a more modern context. So if you look at the bill before the House today, it is amended not only to include the environmental disasters that were outlined in the original legislation, but we've added pandemics, we've added cybersecurity attacks, and we've also added acts of terrorism. And that is something that I believe is laudable. It is very forward-thinking. Based on the range of things that have been added, we're not waiting for the potential act of terrorism or cybersecurity attack to occur. We're preempting that and making sure that we're prepared so that those funds can be dispersed rapidly in the case of an emergency. But not only are we amending the range or the spectrum of catastrophes that are covered, but in addition to allowing individuals whose homes may be damaged in the event of a natural disaster, because those low-income earners are not being excluded in this bill, they've still been included, but what the legislation has sought to do is also to address the need for, and not big business, I kept hearing a reference to business, but to address the needs for small business owners, the hairdressers, the people who might have a small catering company, a small medical practice like mine, to be able to survive what has no doubt caused the greatest economic fallout that we've seen, I believe, since the 1930s. We've seen a situation where over 43,000 unemployment claims have been submitted to the NAS department. It's projected that there's going to be about $450 million shortfall in government's revenues for the year. We've seen schools having been forced to close, entire sectors like tourism being shut down, airports closed, borders closed. The impact cannot be understated, but there's a need to be nimble and adaptable and responsive in times like this. I just wanted to address a few things because it's not a situation where Barbados alone is looking to do this. I did a bit of research, and what I found is that both the IMF and the World Bank had actually made some changes to how they did business, even predating COVID. So in 2015, the IMF transformed what was then known as the Catastrophe Containment Relief Trust to something called the Post-Catastrophe Debt Relief Trust, where they specifically included the risk of a spreading epidemic. The World Bank in 2017, for the first time, launched what are known as pandemic bonds, which sought to have what they call surge funding disbursed to developing countries in the event of a public health crisis. So even though Barbados hadn't changed legislation in anticipation of something like this, the moment has arrived. Just very briefly, because I feel like speakers like Dr. Holder and Dr. Walcott have been quite comprehensive in their contributions, I just wanted to also address two things very, very briefly. The fund had a value of roughly $51 million at the time that we decided to access the funds and to divert them to support not just small businesses, but self-employed persons. Obviously, the idea now is that we're in the middle of the hurricane season, or the hurricane season is just about getting started. What is going to happen to Barbados if a storm comes? But in the wisdom of the economic team, the BERT program was structured in such a way that we are one of two countries in the entire world with what is known as a natural disaster clause built in to our debt restructuring program. And that is a big mouthful, but basically what it means is that should a hurricane or a severe storm strike Barbados, what would happen is that immediately our debt payments are suspended. And what that is intended to do is to free up, to what I understand, close to $700 million, which can then be diverted towards activities including rebuilding infrastructure and systems and getting the country going again. So when you weigh a $51 million fund to the possibility of having up to $700 million being at the government's disposal in the event of a storm or hurricane, we can see that the way that the debt restructuring was organized had a level of redundancy in place where the catastrophe fund is, not to make it sound small, but a drop in the bucket compared to the kind of funds that we would have access to because of the natural disaster clauses. So just to allay some fears on that side. Now, as it pertains to the NAS fund, when this government took the reins of power in 2018, we had a situation where I understand the arrears owed to the NAS department were in the range of $400 million. That was money owed between statutory corporations and state-owned enterprises. So when we talk about the debt restructuring causing the NIS to take a hit, the hit was actually in the fact that contributions were not actually being made to the fund by the previous administration. The hit was caused by that fact, leading to the fact that we required a debt restructuring because the fund was missing contributions because of the last government not actually paying their statutory obligations for close to 4 or 5 years. I was also made to understand that the audit of the NIS department was actually completed this year just before COVID. That report is due to be released within the coming weeks, and every indication is that the fund is in stable form and does not require any government support at this point in time. So members of the House and the public can look forward to that. And further to that, I just wanted to say the fund is doing exactly what it was intended to do. We have a situation where obviously we have, unfortunately, a ballooning level of unemployment. Every week, I mean, it jumped from 23,000 to 43,000 just in a matter of weeks. But my understanding is that 92.5% of people who have filed claims to this point have received their funds. So any worries related to the NAS and its stability and its ability to function in the way in which it's intended, the evidence to this point has been clear that the fund is performing. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. And we have to commend the people who have had to stay up late, be involved in all the meetings and the consultations to make sure that the country remains on a stable footing. When we talk about business, small business in particular, I will say my experience was that when we had our first COVID-19 case on March 17th, I had probably 6 or 7 cancellations from my clinic. The impact was swift and severe, and that followed through for several weeks to the point where it did not even make sense opening. And my story is just one in several hundred, I'm sure. So the intervention is timely. It will have a real impact on households' ability to survive, our ability to put food on our tables, our ability to help others. And that, sir, is what I have to say related to this bill this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Rogers?
Sands must be. Sandsworth? Sands? Senator Sands?
Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, I would have heard some stellar contributions being made in this honorable chamber this morning. I would have heard some stellar contributions being made in this chamber this morning. I would like to commend Senator Holder, because a person in her position who has her heart and ears to the pulse of the business community would know firsthand the impact that COVID-19 has had on the business sector in this country. Now, the leader of government business would have given you a brief overview as it relates to the purpose of this catastrophe fund. And just a quick overview, I would go over a few things with you. Now, this catastrophe fund was first enacted in 2007. And the initial purpose of this act was to provide financial aid to lower income earners, persons who earn $25,000 and less, and owned charter houses that was valued at $150,000 or less. So the purpose of the catastrophe fund in 2007 was specifically to deal with those persons who might be impacted by a natural disaster if it was to occur. And the Catastrophe Fund Act of 2007 would have listed a number of events which would be considered to be a natural disaster so as to initiate the fund. Now, the events that were listed, and I will just list them for you. It was a fire, earthquake, storm, hurricane, sea surge. Most of these things, if not all, were all natural disasters. Something that was unforeseen, that has occurred, has wreaked havoc, and now this fund is initiated to help those persons, those specific group of persons, with aid in terms of rebuilding and repurposing their homes. Now, COVID-19 came onto the scene in 2020. No one could predict or foresee the type of impact that it would have in this country. Now, COVID-19 is a two-headed snake, a two-headed monster, because it not only attacks us as it relates to our health, but it also attacks us as it relates to our economy. There's no rule book to deal with a pandemic. Everybody will have highfalutin ideas as to how we should address issues in a time of crisis. They will have numerous people, when they're not in the driver's seat, willing to oppose and give their views without actually ever producing an alternative course of action, without ever seeking to provide an answer to the problems that the government is facing. Now, as I speak today, this government is facing COVID-19. Now, if in 2007 it was foreseen that we would ever be plagued with a pandemic, maybe it would have been implemented in the act at that time. Because as Senator Holder rightly stated, a catastrophe is exactly the definition of what COVID-19 is. A sudden event that has wreaked havoc, that was unforeseen, and has adverse effects on the country. COVID-19 is a catastrophe, but unfortunately, it was never mentioned within the Catastrophe Fund. So this bill seeks to expand the scope of what is considered to be a catastrophe. Now, 13 years would have passed since the enactment of the Catastrophe Fund Act 2007. And we would have seen worldwide an increase in terrorist acts, an increase in cyber attacks, and now today, a pandemic. None of these things would have been foreseen in 2007. We now face a variety of issues and events which could all be considered catastrophes. So by expanding the scope in this new bill, it now grants this government the opportunity to provide aid in the event that any of those type of events occur. It expands the scope also to create other groups of persons who would now be eligible for aid. So it is no longer limited to just persons who own chattel homes and have, from the working class, who own less than $25,000 a year. It has now been expanded to deal with businesses, because the reality is that businesses in this country help to keep our country going. Without business, there's no employment. So we need, at this critical time, to put pillars in place to help stabilize what little we have left of the economy. Because right now, as I speak, if this government does not deal with the immediate threat, that being COVID-19, tomorrow more persons will go on the breadline. And the day after that, more persons will go on the breadline. More businesses will start to go belly up. More businesses will become bankrupt. And we will play the waiting game and watch as this country implodes. On the one hand, the Minister of Health is fighting at the front line as it relates to the health issue. But on the other hand, we still have to protect our economy. That is the bottom line. These businesses need our help. So what this fund does is make sure that once they pass the criteria, once they pass the test and qualify for aid, those particular businesses are now able to have some cushioning. Now let me just give you an example. So I would fall in the category of a self-employed person, practicing attorney at law. I had a few conveyances recently that I was can't wait till the day that we get the close so that I can see some of these funds come over to me. And I received a phone call from a client who works in the tourism sector. While the particular business she was working for was working on skeleton staff, which means that some of the persons would have already been laid off. She was lucky to survive. She got a call the day in front indicated to her that she too would also be put on the breadline. So her entire life has been put on hold. She intended to buy a piece of this rock. And now the bank or the lending facility is not inclined to release the funds because there's no guarantee she may ever get back her employment next month or the month after. Now, if this fund had been enacted at that time, maybe that business might have been able to keep her employed. And she would be able to continue her life. Granted, the purchasing the property might not be the priority right now at this time, but the point is she would remain employed. This is what this fund will seek to do for many of those businesses right now who pre-COVID-19 were growing businesses, were functioning businesses, were operating normally. But now we stand the risk of losing a significant amount of business in this country. If you take a walk into some of the malls right now that are open, you will notice that some doors are closed and some stores are actually taking things off of the walls. What that says to me is, the ones that the doors remain closed may have resources to pay the half rent or whatever is required for them to keep the space. But the others that don't have resources, that don't have any aid, also fall under the self-employed, also fall under the business sector, have no recourse. And as a result, they have to shut down their entire operation, send home all of their staff. That is the impact that we have as it relates to COVID-19. So when I hear persons suggest that this government is seeking to raid the catastrophe fund, I don't like the word raid, but if he wants to use the word raid, so be it. The reality is that this catastrophe fund is a lifeline. And once it is implemented the right way, the correct way, many persons in this country will be grateful for it. They'll be happy to know that they have a government that is willing to assist the self-employed persons and the business society that did not have any other means of recourse. Remember, these are persons that cannot go to NIS and seek unemployment benefits. These persons don't have a recourse. So if we do nothing with the immediate threat, we stand the risk of having an even major catastrophe post-COVID-19. Now, I don't tend to speak necessarily on the comments that were made to challenge and oppose the purpose for which the catastrophe fund is being proposed to be used. But I always ask, why would a person or persons seek to find an issue with an initiative that is seeking to help persons in need? How do you find an issue with that? I assume we all agree that persons are in need, but we disagree as to how we should help them. And as I said before, while you can oppose for the sake of opposing, I would at a minimum expect that persons would try to table some viable alternative solution, some viable change of course of action. None of that has ever been done. All we hear is, I don't like that, I don't support that, I don't agree with that. Okay, if you don't agree with it, if you don't support it, give me the answer to the problem. They back off. Because there's no answer. The only body with the answers right now is this government. The COVID fund is the answer to help the immediate issue. And I understand the problems as it relates to we might be using the fund during a hurricane season. I will not play down the threat of a hurricane. Senator Drake's highlighted the point that this might be the first time that this country may be due a significant disaster through a hurricane. That may occur, it may not occur. God forbid, I hope it doesn't. But if it does, we were blessed with a good economic team that was able to get a disaster clause implemented in our debt restructuring, so that in the event that a natural disaster does occur during this hurricane season, we would unlock approximately $1.7 billion. Now, let me break that down, because $1.7 billion is just like a figure in the sky. That's literally about 20 other catastrophe funds. So if we use one, which is 50 million or thereabout, we still could potentially have 20 more at our disposal should a disaster occur during this hurricane period. So I ask again, what exactly will be the problem trying to assist the business community that we need that are currently under threat, immediately under threat? The government has a balancing act to deal with. On the one hand, you deal with the immediate threat which COVID-19 poses, And on the other hand, you have to be mindful that there's additional threats that could occur in the future through the hurricane season. And when we put all of this into context, we can rest assured to know that even if we use the catastrophe fund, the $50 million to deal with the businesses, we still have protection in the back end to deal with any other disaster that was to occur as a result of a natural cause. So, when we put this entire catastrophe fund into context, I can see no foul play, I can see no harm, I can see no detriment to anyone. Because this government has operated in a way that it ensures that by using this fund, it does not deplete its entire resource. There is backup resources available to ensure that at any given time, we are always protected. And with those few words, Mr. President, I'm obliged.
Thank you, Senator. I next recognize Senator Rawdon Adams.
Thank you, Mr. President. The problem with speaking this far down the order is you get to hear all these great speeches, facts, figures, and lots of boxes ticked. I was struck in particular by Senator Dr. Holder's contribution, seeing as it underlined the importance, which I think is often overlooked, that there's a marriage between business and worker. And I'd ask listeners and colleagues present to bear that in mind as they think about this bill. And I hope that is clearer. Okay. At the risk of, the only person near me is the back of leader of government business's head, so I think we're safe. But the other point I would underline for what we've heard so far came from the last speech. They are talking about urgency, and these are two themes I think I'm going to try and fill in a little bit. But one thing we haven't heard, as difficult as it is to speak after that group, haven't really heard any echo of what was said in the other place by the leader of the opposition. And I had hoped that Senator Franklin would actually be here today. I wish him a speedy recovery. But I have heard him on social media, and I have heard Reverend Atherley in the other place make the point. He did use the words, we're raiding a fund, but he also spoke extensively about VAT. Why aren't we going back and collecting the VAT? Now, we actually had two dedicated speeches, two dedicated debates to this, both in the other place and here. I think the government covered all the objections, all the comments, all the observations, and I recall Senator McConney making a great conclusion to that debate in here, in which it was dealt with pretty comprehensively. And I don't think there's much point in entertaining whatever the opposition wishes to argue on VAT, given that we've gone over that ground before. In fact, the only thing I could think that would be new is if we could compare and contrast what we heard in the other place with the most notable thing I've heard the Chief Economic Spokesman, I don't know if that's his formal title, but I'm referring to Mr. Weatherhead when he's made pronouncements on VAT. Here we are being criticized for not collecting enough of it, and his most notable pronouncement has been that he won't collect any of it, not 1 red cent, and he would abolish VAT altogether. I'm hearing an interesting aside, but I'm not going to repeat that. So, turning to the title of the bill right here, Catastrophe Fund Bill. The key word is really catastrophe. And when we consider the news that we've heard from around the world, it really falls into two categories. Senator Boyce, I think he's just left the chamber, but on an earlier occasion he made a very nice speech talking about lives versus livelihoods. Now, on the lives part of the equation, I think Barbados and every senator in here can be grateful for the work that's been done by Minister Bostic and his team. Until today, we were 19 days without a new case. But because of the repatriation, I think there are 4 new cases that our protocols have caught, and will put those people into quarantine. So it's a nice record to have had, but I think we should be equally pleased that the protocols catch the additional cases as they arise. I, for one, am very grateful that we've got a Minister of Health and a team that has been so rigorous in a very difficult and stressful time in putting together the system that has been put in place. And when I look at some of the headlines that come across the news media, social media from places like Brazil and India, where the virus is clearly running rampant, or even in countries that have resources that far exceed our own, such as Belgium and the UK, when you consider their mortality rate next to ours or a great many other countries, I think our record stands very, very proud. Now, against that, you have the other half of the equation, which is livelihoods. Now, the headlines there are also really quite shocking. I saw last week, and you could pick these from anywhere, but last week, Germany put out a couple of pieces of data, and one was that their industrial production fell by 18% in April. Another was that year over year, their exports have fallen 24%. Now, that is the kind of impact, and that's just one country. It's similar across the globe. But that's the kind of impact it's far harder for us to immunize ourselves against. We trade internationally. We cannot easily fix other people's problems. Closer to home, and we've heard the number being given in there, but our own equivalent is this number, 43,000, or more precisely, it's 42,790 odd. This is the number of people who are claiming unemployment benefit and putting a great deal of strain on the NIS. Now, there are many countries that don't even have a welfare system that could have coped with that volume of unemployment claimants anyway. Ours can for the moment, but it's not something that is sustainable in even the medium term. Now, you look down from that number, those 43,000 people, and this goes back to what Senator Dr. Holder was talking about. They come from businesses. In this country, there are about 1,000 businesses that trade between $500,000 and $20 million a year. That's their sales turnover. And they by far represent the bulk of our employers, but also the contributions to NIS and the contributions to the tax take. Now, anecdotally, I know some senators in here live off anecdotes, so I'll concede straight away this is anecdotally, not hard data. But in the restoration, food and restaurant business, it looks like many of those firms are running at 20% of what they normally turn over. That is catastrophic, to use a word that we're going to hear a lot today. And further down the chain, anything connected with tourism is probably running between 0 and 5, maybe 7% of what they normally see. So I look at those things, and I hear comments about VAT and raids and so forth, and it strikes me that as enthusiastically as some in the opposition embrace social distancing, they may be taking it a little bit far in this example. They're just social distancing themselves out of the grasp of understanding the immediacy and urgency of the problem here. This is not about VAT. This is 43,000 people or thereabouts on unemployment benefit on a system that can't take that strain for a great deal of time. Now, why do I say that? We've also heard people saying, well, you already got taxes in this area. Why don't you just use those taxes or that area? Senator Haynes earlier mentioned a piece of data in her contribution. The Ministry of Finance expects a shortfall in our tax take of $450 million. $450 million. So, on the one hand, 43,000 claimants, a system under pressure. On the other hand, a shortfall in the government revenue, including corporate tax, of $450 million. What we've got in sum is households, domestic businesses hunkering down, conserving cash, in no rush to spend anything other than what they really have to. There's a hesitancy there that's common in financial crises, a level of confidence, a wait-and-see attitude. If we don't find a way to break that cycle of wait and see, that period of time that it takes to break the cycle has the potential to turn into a real, again, catastrophe for us. So when we talk about repurposing the $51.4 million in this fund, it's more than just repurchasing. It's part of a concerted effort to break this hesitancy, this wait-and-see attitude, to get people out spending, to preserve jobs, to reduce that 43,000 strong number in a welfare system that simply isn't designed to sustain that level of benefit for any serious length of time. And this is urgent. This is not. I take Senator Drake's remarks, and they're good ones, about actuarial review and audits and the demographic impact and so on. But there's an urgency here that's well beyond that. We need to take action, and we need to take it quickly to fix this. No one wants to see a situation where you have that number of people and some significant proportion of them nudge back into poverty because the system breaks down. You have absolutely to avoid that. Now I'm going to join this current set of remarks to another that we'll probably be having this time next week or maybe in the next 10 days, and that relates to the BOSS program. Here we're really talking about money that's going to go towards preserving jobs, preserving benefits to some degree, helping small businesses get through this. A lot of that is operating expenditure, providing working capital to small businesses. But against that, and what you have to recognize is that we have a pipeline of projects, capital expenditure projects in this country that totals nearly $3 billion. Just like households and domestic small business, they also are hesitant to proceed. There's a wait-and-see attitude there amongst the financiers, whether they are domestic or international. Now, there is nothing like instilling confidence and breaking this cycle of wait-and-see as a government prepared to spend its own money to walk the talk and put down money to kickstart CapEx projects to show everybody that they are prepared to protect jobs. And when we come to have that debate, it's worth considering it in light of what we're actually talking about today. Quite a few speakers have said that the Catastrophe Fund wasn't really designed for what we're setting out to do today. That's true. Some things you can't foresee, but you have to be prepared to be pragmatic and flexible in the way you approach legislation and the way you change it. I don't think anybody believes this isn't a catastrophe, and we have to be pragmatic and flexible and make the law work for us. That's something that we said before in here, and it's worth repeating. This is just not a time to socially distance ourselves from reality. This is the time to take action, and this government is doing it. I'm pleased and I'm proud to support this bill, and I commend it to the rest of the chamber. I'm obliged, sir.
Okay, 2 minutes. Or you want to
Thank you, Mr. President. I wasn't sure. Mr. President, I just want to thank all honourable members who spoken in support of this bill, including the honourable member representing the opposition. But there were some queries that were raised. I know one or two of them might just have been addressed. Just to reinforce that the Catastrophe Fund at March the 31st had in its portfolio $51.4 million. I'm told that the 16th Actuarial review, which was due at the end of December 2017, is presently with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for review. The Ministry of Finance for review, and will be no doubt laid in this honourable chamber within the next coming weeks. As of June the 4th, 45,340 claims for unemployment were made. I'm informed that 40,311 have been paid. A total quantum of $46.9 million has been paid, but in fact, this is 27,422 persons who would have benefited. In other words, some people make more than one claim. In terms of the, yes, and the Act provides for the actuarial review, and it's done every 3 years. So and the government of Barbados is committed to providing the NAS with appropriate liquidity when necessary. And I have no doubt that within the coming weeks, as this will be addressed by the Honourable Prime Minister in terms of the NAS and its stability and its liquidity. With those few words, I want to beg that this bill be now read a second time.
The question is that the bill under consideration be now read a second time. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honour do not leave the chair and this chamber resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do now leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into a committee of the entire Senate for the further consideration of the bill before us in committee. All honourable members in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. The ayes have it, and we are now in committee.
The Senate is now in committee.
They can call in. Clauses 1 to 5.
Chairman, I beg to move that clauses 1 to 5 stand part.
The question is that clauses 1 to 5 stand part. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clauses 6 to 10.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clauses 6 to 10 stand part.
The question is that clauses 6 to 10 stand part. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clauses 11 to 14.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clauses 11 to 14 stand part.
The question is that clauses 11 to 14 stand part. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
First schedule.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Schedule 1 be the first schedule to this bill.
The question is that Schedule 1 be the first schedule to the bill. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye.
Second
Those
schedule.
against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
I beg to move that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill.
The question is that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Third schedule.
Chairman, I beg to move that the third schedule be the third schedule to the bill.
The question is that the third schedule be the third schedule to the bill. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Report.
Chairman, I beg to move that you do now report His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do not report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Chairman has reported to me the passage of the bill under consideration in committee.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be now read a third time.
The question is that the bill be now read a third time. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Catastrophe Fund Act 2020.
The question is that the bill do now pass and be so cited. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. The bill has now been passed and will be so cited.
Mr. President, I beg that this sitting be now suspended until 2:15.
Question is that this session be now suspended until the next hour, 2:15. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it, and we are now in suspension for the next hour.